Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church Sunday School Lesson number 4, Sunday, December 24th, 2017. The lesson is entitled Faithful Seekers of the King. The lesson comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. We were asked to read the same. The places are Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The time is 4 or 5 BC. Our narrative begins with the introduction of the wise men from the east. Tradition places the number at 3, although some suggest there may have been as many as 12, and gives the names Caspar, Melchior, and Belazar. Their trip to Bethlehem probably began in Persia, hundreds of miles from the land of Israel. The duration of the wise men's quest might have been over a year, as they followed the recognized trade routes of their period. Today's aim. Facts. To understand the background and reasoning for the actions of the wise men. Principle. To recognize the opposition, difficulty, and tenacity associated with the faith of the wise men. Application. To understand that God is at work in every culture and circumstance, leading people to his Son so that they may realize who he is and worship him. Illustrating the lesson. The wise men recognized that the Christ child was destined to become the King of Israel in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. They acknowledged their inferior position to him through the act of sacrificial worship. Practical points. 1. Do not be deterred by humble beginnings when you know God is at work. Matthew 2:1. 2. When you search for Christ, trust that you will find him. Verse 2. 3. Expect that there will always be those who are threatened by Christ and will oppose him. Verses 3 through 4. 4. Many seek after Christ but do not recognize him because he works in ways they do not understand. Verses 5 through 6. 5. Trust God to guide you as you encounter evil or unclear motives. Verses 7 through 8. 6. An encounter with Jesus will change the direction of a life. Verses 9 through 12. Golden text. When they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Matthew 2:11. Today we have 2 lesson outlines. A biblical revelation coming from Matt 2:1 through 6. And the second is a protective revelation coming from Matt 2:7 through 12. Introduction. At the time of the Exodus from Egypt, Moses was told to consecrate to God the firstborn males of Israel, both human and animal. Exodus 13:1 through 2, 12 through 13. God then emphasized that his people were to establish the Feast of Unleavened Bread as an annual reminder of Israel's release from Egyptian slavery. All the firstborn in Egypt, both human and animal, had been slain when the Lord went through the land at midnight, thus causing Pharaoh and all his people to urge Israel to get out of their land. The people of Israel were never forgotten that by strength of hand the Lord brought them out from this place. Exodus 13:3. This truth was repeated in verses 9, 14, and 16. The Exodus and all that occurred as part of it was never to be forgotten by the children of Israel. Even greater than the Exodus from Egypt was the birth of Jesus Christ. Every year, Christmas and Easter remind us that Jesus' birth and resurrection are essential truths to our beliefs. We should never tire of reminding ourselves of their importance. A biblical revelation, Matt 2:1. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. Verse 2, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. Verse 3, When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Verse 4. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. Verse 5. And when they said unto him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. Verse 6. And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Birth leading to a question. Matt 2, 1 through 2. We usually turn to Luke 2 to find the details of the birth of Jesus, for Matthew did not include as much information. All we read in Matthew is that Mary was betrothed to Joseph and found to be with child before their marriage. Chapter 1, verse 18. Then we read about God's dealings with Joseph and how he should handle the situation. This is followed by the statement that Joseph knew her not till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus. Verse 25. Matthew 2 begins with now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. Without giving any details, Matthew jumps right to the coming of the wise men sometime later. Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, who reigned from 34 to 4 BC, which means that Jesus' birth did not occur in AD 1, as we would expect. The year of Jesus' birth was determined some 5 years later by a Scythian monk living in Rome, and his calculations were off by a few years. On our present calendar, therefore, Jesus' birth falls between 6 and 4 BC. Herod's father was of Idumean descent, that is, he was an Edomite, a descendant of Esau. He became influential in the Roman Empire and was largely responsible for his son becoming the ruler of the Jews of Judah. Herod's lack of Jewishness might partly explain his reaction to someone perceived as a threat to his throne. The wise men, who probably came from the land of Babylon, caused Herod special concern when they arrived, seeking one who had a special birth. Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. Matt 2:2. Hearing this question and the explanation accompanying it surely caused intense fear and instant hatred in Herod's heart, for he himself was not a native born king of the Jews. The wise men were not magicians as we think of magicians, but they were eager students of astronomy. How they knew that the sighting of an unusual star related to the special birth of Israel's king in the vicinity of Jerusalem is not known. Stress leading to an inquiry. Matt 2, 3 through 4. Herod was troubled by the wise men's inquiry. Not only was he not Jewish, but he was also considered by the Jewish people to be a usurper to his role of leadership. If a baby had been born with the right to the throne, the people might try to overthrow him and turn to this new king. Herod was a ruthless man and suspicious of any possible threat to his position. Some historians believe he was clinically unstable mentally. In many ways, Herod's attitudes were similar to those of the Pharaoh who ordered the murder of male babies born to the Israelites in Egypt. Exodus 1, 15 through 16. The Jews would have liked to rid themselves of Roman rule, so this left Herod in an uneasy position, making everything a potential threat. The fact that all Jerusalem was troubled at the time, too, probably indicates that the people feared how Herod might react to the news the wise men brought. The people knew he was a brutal person. At least Herod knew where he might get an answer for the wise men's questions. He called in all the chief priests and scribes of the Jews. These men were the religious scholars who knew the scriptures well. So he knew they would have knowledge of where their Messiah was prophesied to be born. His connection to the Christ with the wise men's reference to the King of the Jews reveals some understanding of the Jews' expectations. He was aware of their messianic hopes and their desire to be free of Rome. The people of Israel were expecting their Messiah to be a political deliverer. This is one main reason they missed recognizing him when he came offering spiritual salvation. They wanted someone to come as a military leader and lead them to freedom from the dominance of Rome. If Herod understood this mentality, it is no wonder he felt threatened upon hearing that one being referred to as the King of the Jews had been born. He felt he had to get rid of this potential threat as quickly as possible. Quote leading to an answer, Matt 2, 5 through 6. The biblical scholars knew immediately where to find the answer to Herod's inquiry. Being students of the Old Testament scriptures, they knew that the prophet Micah had specifically identified the birthplace of Messiah many centuries earlier, so they quoted his text. This gave Herod the exact information he wanted and made it possible for the wise men to proceed on their search. Warren Worsby observed, the Magi were seeking the king. Herod was opposing the king, and the Jewish priests were ignoring the king. These priests knew the scriptures and pointed others to the Savior, but they would not go to worship him themselves. They quoted Micah 5:2, but did not obey it. They were 5 miles from the very Son of God, yet they did not go to see him. The Gentiles sought and found him, but the Jews did not. Matthew is known for his many Old Testament quotes. His purpose in writing was to present Jesus as the promised King of Israel, and he often pointed to fulfilled prophecy as part of his argument. In this case, however, he quoted the spiritual leaders of Israel who noted 2 passages in their answer to Herod. The primary passage revealing Bethlehem as the Messiah's birthplace is Micah 5:2. But the scholars added a thought that is not included in that verse, that the Messiah would rule or shepherd God's people. This last thought seems to come from 2 Samuel 5:2 and originally referred to David. The quote or allusion is a somewhat free redemption. Perhaps without realizing it, the religious leaders were connecting the birth of Jesus to the Davidic covenant, which is what Matthew did in the very first verse of his gospel. The little town of Bethlehem in Judea was the birthplace of the one who will eternally occupy the throne of David and rule forever. A protective revelation. Verse 7. Then Herod, when he had previously called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. Verse 8. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search diligently for the young child, and when ye have found him, bring him word again, that I may come and worship him also. Verse 9. And when they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star with which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. Verse 10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. Verse 11, and when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Verse 12, and being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. Deceptive instruction. Matthew 2, 7 through 8. Apparently, Herod was concerned about the disturbance among the people that the presence of the wise men had caused. So he had called them back to him secretly. They had been present when he questioned the scribes and priests. So now that he had his answer about the place of Jesus' birth, he brought them back in order to inform them. There was one more piece of information Herod desperately needed in order to make his plans for dealing with this unexpected crisis. Herod wanted a time frame for the appearance of the star the wise men had followed. This would give him a fair idea about how long ago the birth had occurred and how old the baby might now be. We know from what follows that this was a very sinister question. Herod's motives were nothing like what he presented to these wise men. We are not told what answer the wise men gave to this question, but the evidence is that they had probably traveled well over a year on their journey to Jerusalem. When Herod sent them on their way, he gave specific, clear instructions to them. They were to diligently search for the young child, and when they had found him, they were to return with word of his location. The king professed a shared desire to worship him too. In all this, we see Herod's veiled fear, the curiosity and interest of the wise men, and the complete lack of interest on the part of the religious leaders. These later men had given Herod the answer he wanted, and they seemingly disappeared into their routine lives with no follow-up. Herod's claim of desiring to worship the new king was a complete fabrication, but his visitors completely did not realize he planned murder. The wise men had no reason to expect that Herod would do anything other than pay homage to a king, and Herod had no reason to think that the wise men would not return with the information he needed. Joyful discovery, Matthew 2:9 through 10. The wise men quickly left Herod's presence and headed toward the town of Bethlehem, about 5 miles away. We do not know how far they had gone before the star reappeared, but there it was again. We can imagine their words of excitement when it was spotted. "Look, men, there's that star again. Now we know for sure that we're on the right track in our search." After a long journey, they were finally near their destination. The text clearly indicates the star was moving as it led them. Stars, however, normally appear to travel from east to west across the sky, not north to south. But both its original appearance and its reappearance accompanied by the movement were miraculous. While some try to explain this as a natural phenomenon that God used, others suggest it might have been the Shekinah glory of God. No matter how God accomplished this sign, it was a clear miracle because of its timing and movement. Another facet of the miraculous in this situation is that once the star was directly above Jesus' location, it stopped its motion. It has been suggested by some Bible students that maybe the star stopped over Bethlehem and the wise men then inquired about the dwelling place of Jesus' family from the local residents. After all, Jesus was no longer in a stable, for many months had passed since his birth. The text seems to make clear, however, that the star stood over the very spot. Excitement turned into genuine joy as the wise men rejoiced at the sight of the star. We would, of course, expect that they would be happy to see the star again, for it confirmed that they had completed their quest. But their rejoicing was not an ordinary satisfaction. They overflowed with exceedingly great joy. There was an intensity to their emotion that they could barely express. We can only consider how their conversation progressed as they took the last few steps towards the goal they had long been seeking. Divine direction, Matthew 2:11 through 12. Entering the house where Jesus was must have been an exhilarating moment for these men. It had been a long, arduous journey, but it had finally come to its end. There they were in the presence of the one for whom they had searched. They saw the young child with Mary, his mother, who perhaps was holding him on her lap. Their immediate response was to fall down and worship him. We should note that the worship was entirely for Jesus and not his mother, for she was merely the human being chosen by God to give him birth. There is no evidence in Scripture that she should be elevated to a position of worship, even though she deserves our highest respect for being such a godly woman as to be chosen for this most unusual privilege. The wise men then presented to Jesus the gifts they had brought. It was a customary practice in Eastern nations to offer gifts to a superior, or in doing this, they were acknowledging their recognition of the importance and even the superiority of this little boy. In God's providence, the gifts might have special significance not explained in the text, although the wise men would not have thought in these terms. God reminds us of his deity and purity. Gold reminds us of his deity and purity. Frankincense of the fragrance of his life to those who believed in him, and myrrh of his coming sacrificial death, since myrrh was used in embalming. It has often been assumed that there were 3 wise men because of the number of gifts, but that is by no means certain. There might have been many more than 3 men. God directly intervened in the protection of his son by warning the wise men in a dream that they should not report back to Herod. This led to Herod's horrific killing of Bethlehem's babies, Matt 2:16. But Jesus was spared to fulfill God's plan for our salvation. The wise men obeyed God's warning and returned home another way. Questions. 1. How does Matthew's account of Jesus' birth compare to Luke's? 2. What are some things we know about Herod that explain why he felt threatened by the birth of a king? 3. To whom did Herod turn to find an answer to the wise men's question about the newborn king? 4. What was the answer of these religious men, and what did they quote to support their answer? 5. What other piece of information did Herod want, and why? 6. What specific instruction did Herod give the wise men as they left? 7. What was Herod's real intent, and did the wise men realize it? 8. What caused the wise men to rejoice as they resumed their travel? 9. What did the wise men do when they entered Jesus' presence? 10. How did God protect his son at this time? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, December 24th, 2017. Thank you for listening. God bless.